Hello, my dear viewers. This amazing story will be very instructive for you. It is very interesting and beautiful. I wish you enjoy watching it. It was the first day Mary decided to live life to the fullest. Enough was enough. I'm a woman, I'm only 35, and I'm entitled to happiness, she thought as she opened the travel agency website on her computer. For the first time in 3 years, she decided to allow herself a little relaxation and go with her son to some warm countries for a week. Colorful pictures of tours flashed before her eyes. It took her a long time to choose. Mary chose Los Angeles. She had flown there often in her college days. First with her girlfriends, and then with her family. Her son, Bruno, and her husband, George, met Marina when she was only 25. Stately, rich, handsome, young, and with a mole at her chin. The girl immediately lost control over herself and decided to tie her life to this man. At first it was all like in cheap novels. Travel, flowers, endless happiness. A baby. But a year after Bruno was born, things slowly began to change. George stopped coming home from work on time. He stayed there until midnight. Her husband's business trips turned into monthly trips, usually to some southern country. Mary resolutely drove herself away from the thought of a mistress. But George gave more and more reasons. The conversations went nowhere. Her husband resolutely denied everything. In spite of this, Mary continued to love him. She asked George to be home more often, if only for Bruno's sake. But her husband didn't pay much attention to his son either. He just gave Mary money and disappeared. One night he disappeared again. Only this time for good. Almost every day Mary thought back to that fateful day. She replayed every minute of it. And at first she cried, but then she couldn't cry anymore. She could barely contain herself, not to show her despair and sadness to Bruno, for whom Daddy was still on an extended business trip. Yesterday, Mary was determined to go over this scenario in her head. The last time Mary walked around the apartment that February night for the third day in a row with phone in hand, he was away on a business trip and was due back 3 days ago. His phone was unavailable. He didn't answer his messages. "Mom, why are you so sad?" her 5-year-old son Bruno asked. "Me, I'm not sad." "Why aren't you asleep yet?" the boy sighed, turned around and wandered back to his room. He had no idea that anything had happened to his father. George had had very little contact with him anyway, and in the last 6 months he hadn't been in his room at all. So the boy's father's absence had not changed anything in his usual childhood life. Mary called the firm where her husband worked as managing partner. George said that they were opening a new production facility in Siberia, so he needed to fly there. The girl managed to get in touch with the CEO of the firm. "Hello," she said excitedly. She had participated in the firm's corporate events several times and was acquainted with the director. "I want to know about my husband's business trip. Do you know how it goes there? You see, I haven't been able to get a hold of George. He should have been home 3 days ago." "What business trip?" The director was surprised. "Mary, what are you talking about?" As a woman, I almost dropped the phone. "We are not opening a new factory. We don't have any plans." "There are no plans. And George warned me that he's taking 2 weeks off at his own expense." "Mary, I really don't know what you're talking about." "Thank you," Mary whispered and dropped the phone. She slowly sat down on the couch and covered her face with her hands. George's lies had gone beyond all reasonable limits this time. If before he had somehow tried to cover himself with masks, now her husband had simply decided not to come home, turning off the phone. It was beneath my dignity to take it any further. Of course, she should have left earlier, even from the first hints of a mistress. But for Bruno's sake, Mary stayed with George. A husband could provide a child with a comfortable life, an education and travel. And by leaving George, Mary would have had to raise the child and work at the same time. There is no telling how long she would have survived such a regime and what Bruno would have been like. Though, of course, that was not the only reason Mary refused to leave her husband. She continued to love him, despite George's disgusting behavior, but now she needed to push herself over the edge. No more humiliation. Many women walk away and manage to raise even a few children. And with Bruno, Mary can certainly handle it. The thought was interrupted by a phone call. Michael was calling back for some reason. "Mary, it's me again." Anyway, I got a call. Yes, George is indeed on a business trip, but not at the plant. The director spoke quickly and uncertainly. "I think it's probably better not over the phone. Maybe I'll come up to you now." Mary agreed. She moved as quickly as she could and waited for Michael. The office of George's firm was about 10 minutes away, so it wasn't long before the doorbell rang. After saying hello, the director entered the apartment. He and Mary sat down on the sofa and were silent for about 15 seconds. He didn't know where to begin. "Mary," he began with a heavy sigh. "Anyway, George went to the Arctic to ride his snowmobile on the ice. They go there a lot, George and his friends, often." Mary never ceased to be surprised by new discoveries about her husband's personal life. "Yes, but that's not the point now. A colleague came into my office right after you called and gave me some information from the Arctic. There's been a slight warming there now. Snowmobiling, of course, is forbidden in such conditions. But, what are you saying?" Mary couldn't take it anymore. But George decided to go down on the ice and failed. "How could it be?" The woman went pale. "Mary, are you all right? Should we call an ambulance?" Frightened, Michael asked. "Don't do that. Is he dead?" "The thing is, it happened far away from the shore. There were strong underwater currents, so George's body has not yet been found. But rescuers say there's no chance of him being found alive." Mary was hit over the head with a hammer. 15 minutes ago she was. She was cursing him. She was determined to get away from him. And now she would find out he was dead. Mary stared into the void. Images of their lives flashed before her like an old silent movie. Michael went to the kitchen and brought the woman a glass of water. "But, I promise," the director reassured Mary, "the firm will help you. And with the inheritance, and with all the legal issues. But how is that possible if George hasn't been found? What if he's still alive? It happens. A man can be declared dead without a body being found. I understand your reluctance to accept this loss. But I've been assured that George had no chance of survival. I'm sorry." Mary was no longer listening to what Michael was saying. Oh, tears streamed from her eyes. She didn't know how to live her life anymore. After pulling herself together, she saw the principal off and sat down in the kitchen. "Why are you crying, Mother?" Mary didn't notice Bruno enter the kitchen. "What are you doing?" "I'm not crying. I just have tears in my eyes." "What are you doing up again?" "I heard you talking to some uncle. It's an uncle from Daddy's work." "Where's Daddy?" "Daddy?" Mary was quiet. She didn't know what to say next. She didn't want to tell her 5-year-old child that his father was dead. Nor did she want to tell him that he had gone to heaven. So Mary decided to stall, at least for a while, until he asked about Daddy again. "Is Daddy back on the road again?" "As usual, only this time he is. He's staying longer." "What's he doing there?" Bruno was at the age when children ask endless questions. And these questions were especially difficult for Mary to answer now. He is engaged in the discovery of new worlds, exploring mountains, lakes, seas. In general, he works and travels. "I want to discover new worlds, too. When you grow up, you'll discover whatever you want. And now you have to go to bed. You know that man grows the most in his sleep. So the earlier you go to bed, the faster you'll grow. Come on, go to bed. The boy went to the door but suddenly stopped, turned around and asked a question he had never asked in all of George's travels. When is Daddy coming back? I don't know. Mary could hardly contain herself from sobbing in front of the baby. Not for a long time. He has a difficult and long journey. He's tackling tough challenges, opening up a new world. We can't do it in a week, you know. Yes. He didn't nod and went off to his room. For the first time in years, Mary was even a little glad that her husband paid little or no attention to the child. She couldn't imagine how she would have explained what had happened to Bruno if George had been an attentive and loving father. Now, there was a chance that after a while, the boy would forget his daddy altogether and would even ask. Of course, years from now, when Bruno was a teenager, she would have to tell him the whole truth, but that would be later. For now, the most important thing for Mary was to save the boy's psyche as much as possible, and not to burden him with disturbing news. But what was to be her own treason? George's second life and other problems did not ease her worries about his death. Mary had realized before that she loved her husband, but now she felt it most keenly. She was psychologically trapped. If at the time when she had been determined to leave her husband, Mary had been able to numb her feelings and affection for him with anger and resentment, she could not do so now. She could not be resentful and angry at the man who had left her life. His infidelities seemed to have been erased from her memory. She remembered only the positive aspects of their relationship. Most of the happy moments had been at the beginning of their journey together. And it was from those times that memories now came flooding back to Mary. She went into the room and pulled out a family album from the shelf. Flipping through a few pages, Mary saw a picture of her and George sitting on a snowmobile somewhere in the Caucasus. Back then, her husband took her with him on all his travels and business trips, including on snowmobile rides. He was a professional. He could drive a snowmobile with his eyes closed, Mary remembered, wiping away her tears. How had he allowed such a horrible situation to happen? Was it so unlike him? No, it wasn't. We must wait until his body is found. I can't believe it. The woman slammed the album shut. She managed to literally come to her senses for a few minutes, to calm down a little as she felt an incredible bitterness again. Mary managed to hold back her tantrums only by thinking of her son's peace of mind. She wanted to run somewhere, to call, to scream, to sound the alarm, to demand that. The search for her husband continued. She thought about dialing Michael's number again, but she stopped in time. What good would that do now? There would be no way for Mary to influence the search. Convincing someone that her husband couldn't have died so ridiculously because he was good at snowmobiling was foolish. She pulled herself together again and sat down on the couch. Mary sat up, and she couldn't even think about anything. She wanted to go to sleep soon and wake up as usual. Watching her husband rushing off to work, who would quietly leave her by and disappear again for a few days. Mary took pills of valerian and lay down. She tried to sleep, it didn't work. Mary mentally told herself to hope and wait. She didn't want to let her husband go. More precisely, Mary was ready to let him go from her family, but she couldn't let George go from her life at all. The valerian began to work and Mary managed to sleep after all. With each passing day, hope and waiting sounded less and less and less in her head. George was officially declared dead, though the body was never found. Michael had kept his promise. He had helped arrange the inheritance. He supported her financially. He got her a telecommuting job at the firm. Mary managed to combine raising a child with earning a living, but she couldn't let go of her husband. For 3 years of virtual mourning, Mary denied herself vacations and entertainment, and she smiled only when she was with her son. He remained the only meaning in her life. And so 3 years passed. A friendly girl smiled at the website's page and held tickets in one hand and a sign in the other. Happy holidays for the whole family. Mary sighed heavily and pressed the buy button. Bruno, she said loudly after the purchase. In a week, we're going on vacation to Los Angeles. For 7 days, she'd been packing for the trip with her son. And the packing was not so much in the sense of things, but in the sense of psychological acceptance of his new life, her new image. Not an image without the consolation of a widow, whom her husband had cheated for several years and then died in an accident, but the image of a woman living a full life. Time flew by very quickly, and Mariah didn't even notice how the week passed. It was time to move on to the airport. Once she got to Brunei, she sat down in the lounge. The last time Mary had been at the airport with George was 5 years ago, when they had sent their son to his grandmother's and decided to take a week's vacation in Turkey. The memories came flooding back to her, but she managed to push them away. Mary took Bruno's hand and, amidst an endless stream of people, made her way toward the departure gate. There were fewer people near the boarding gate, and she and her son sat down just outside their ghetto. She sat down and looked at her fellow passengers, who were also waiting for their flight to Los Angeles. For the most part, people were in a cheerful mood. Most of them were probably on their way to a vacation. A group of young people were laughing at an internet video, and 2 elderly women were flipping through newspapers. The kind of newspapers that are usually on the counters at airports. A few rows further down sat a couple. A girl, dyed blonde, about 25, and a man in a wide hat and glasses. It was hard to tell how old the man was because he was sitting with his companion turned and his head slightly bowed. Thus, his face was completely obscured by the hat. The man was telling the girl something passionately, but she didn't look interested. She was immersed in her phone and did not react to his story. Mary did not continue to watch the fascinating relationship between the man in the hat and his companion, and she turned her attention to the phone herself. 15 minutes later, the announcer announced boarding. Mary and Bruno reached their seats. The boy sat by the window, and his mother next to him. "Bruno, this is your first conscious flight," said his mother cheerfully to her son. The last time she and her son flew in an airplane together was when he was not even 2 years old. "This is so cool, Mom. It's so cool that we're flying with you." "You probably don't remember the last time you flew," Mary asked and was horrified to realize she shouldn't have asked that question. "Well," the boy looked out of the window. "No, I don't remember anything at all." Mary sighed in relief. She was worried that some images of his father might come to mind. In the last 3 years, the boy had hardly remembered his father. He only asked at first about his trips to explore new worlds. Mary made up some stories as she went along. About Daddy's group being stranded from the flying weather, that they met some unusual people, and lots of other fabulous nonsense. Bruno was growing up and there were fewer and fewer questions about Daddy. In the last year and a half, he hadn't asked him a single question about him. But Mary still worried all the time. After all, his classmates might say something about their dads. That might have caused her to have more questions about her father. But luckily, that didn't happen. Maybe because she was acquainted with the mothers of Bruno's friends. Those mothers, knowing the situation, asked their children not to bring up dads around him. Or maybe she was just lucky. But she understood that she still had to have a serious conversation with her son in the next few years. Mary even sought the advice of a psychologist. What was the best way to do it? She was advised various psychological techniques, but she could not find one that suited her. "Mom, look, we're over the clouds." The boy marveled at the flight. She looked at her son and remembered his and Bruno's flight. The boy sitting in George's arms and quietly looking out the window. The other children were shouting to the whole cabin, but Bruno was sitting quietly. Mary looked at them then and couldn't enjoy such a family environment. She could not have imagined that such a family flight with her son would be her last. A year and a half later, she and George were also going on vacation, but this time without Bruno. The first misunderstandings and suspicions had already begun in Mary and George's relationship, and the purpose of that vacation was to get them back together, but they never did. On the contrary, things got worse after the vacation. Mary called a stewardess and asked for water. She didn't want to go back to her memories of her husband. But the memory played tricks on her. Mary began to worry again. She was even resentful of herself for disrupting her own decision to start a new life. But nothing, we have to try. Mary closed her eyes and tried to sleep. "Mom, I have to go to the bathroom." The son woke the mother up. "Let me do it. I'll walk you to the bathroom." "But Mom, I'm old enough to find the bathroom on an airplane. I'm already 8 years old. Besides, my aunt showed me before the flight. If there's anything, I'll ask her." "How smart are you?" Mary said, and led her son into the aisle. She accompanied Bruno to the front of the plane, where he was met by a stewardess who ushered him into the lavatory, making sure he got to the right place. Window. The plane had long since gained the right altitude and was flying steady. But after a minute, a voice was heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We are approaching an area of turbulence. Please remain calm. The situation is normal. It will stop in a minute." No sooner had the pilot finished his words than the plane shook. "Bruno, my boy," Mary thought of her son. He was frightened. Mom got up from her seat and wanted to go to the bathroom. But a woman's voice was heard from behind. "Young lady, please sit down in your seat. We are in a turbulence zone, and safety regulations require." The flight attendant wanted to put Mary in her seat, but she interrupted her. "I have a son in there. I need to get through. Don't worry, he'll be fine." At this moment, Bruno came out of the bathroom. He walked calmly toward his cubicle, but then abruptly stopped. When Bruno came very close, Mary saw his pale and frightened face. Her mother spoke in a trembling voice. "Son, what are you frightened of?" "It's called turbulence." "There's nothing to be afraid of." Mary decided that it was the sudden shaking that caused her son's fright. Mom repeated in an almost whisper, "There's Dad with some ants sitting there." Mary quickly let her son into his seat. "Son, what are you talking about? You must be imagining things." "No, I definitely saw it. Only his hair was different. Otherwise, it was him." "Go and have a look. You must be very tired from your long flight. Let's get some sleep. Let's let the back of the chair go and you can stick it in." "Don't you believe me?" "Why not? I do. It's just, there are so many people on Earth and some of them can be very similar. That's why you probably met some uncle who looked a lot like you." "I know for a fact it was him," said the boy, folding his arms and staring out the window. Mary realized that there was no point in trying to change her mind. It was all the more difficult for her to maintain a calm, relaxed tone. Pretending for her son that everything was all right inside, she was much more worried about Bruno. She tried to convince herself that no George could sit there. I guess the boy had a flashback to that childhood flight after all. That's what made him think his daddy was out there. It would seem that making sure of this would be quite easy. All she had to do was get up and walk to the bathroom and back. But Mary hesitated to do so. What if there really was a man sitting there who looked a lot like George? And that might put her out of her mind completely. Mary stayed seated for the rest of the flight. She wasn't even afraid to turn her head toward the aisle. An hour and a half later, the plane began to descend, and 20 minutes later landed safely. Passengers jumped up from their seats and began to retrieve their belongings from the overhead shelves, while the plane didn't even have time to stop at the gangway. Mary was not one of that group of people in a hurry. And not wanting to stand dressed in the aisle with her son for another 5 minutes, she decided to sit and wait for the door to open and for the bulk of the people to leave the plane. Mary sat quietly and watched the people standing there. At that moment, a man in one of the front rows rose from his seat and reached for his belongings. Mary immediately realized that this was the man she had mistaken for her father. The man really did look incredibly like George. Only his face was a little fatter and a shorter haircut. He reached for his hat, and Mary saw a mole on his chin. It couldn't be, she thought. No, it was some kind of dream. Some ridiculous coincidence. A coincidence. I don't want to believe it. It's delusional. Mary was trembling. It was very difficult for her to hide her emotions. But for her son's sake, she did. Meanwhile, the man put on his broad hat and took the blonde girl by the hand and stood in the aisle as well. The hat again covered his face from Mary's gaze. People began to come out, and after a couple of minutes she began to gather. Mary purposely waited even longer than usual, so she wouldn't accidentally run into that man. As she stepped off the plane down the ramp, she couldn't get past the airline employee who was standing at the check-in counter. Mary understood that this girl was in charge of another flight, but she needed to vent some emotion and work through the situation. "Excuse me, can I find out if there was a person on the flight with me?" "Young lady, I'm sorry, but I'm waiting for another flight. But in theory, you could open the database. It's the same airline. Theoretically, I could, but that would violate the law on personal data. Young lady, I'm asking you to step in." Perhaps Mary bumped into the airline employee's ear and quietly, so as not to be heard by Bruno, continued, "There was my husband who had gone missing a few years ago." The girl looked first at Mary and then at Bruno. Apparently, the childish look managed to pierce her integrity, and she decided to break the rules. The girl typed something into her screen and asked for a last name, a first name. "George Becken. There was no such person on your flight. Everybody, I'm sorry. But I ask you to step back and not tell anyone what I did." "Yes, of course," Mary answered, confused. "I'm sorry." She took her hand. Bruno and typed slowly. "To the baggage claim lounge." Mary stared at that black ribbon, where the suitcases rode leisurely. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the man in the hat again. He had already retrieved his luggage and was on his way out with his companion. It was a good thing it wasn't him, Mary thought to herself, or I don't know what I would have done. Coincidences like that happen. But the mole. No, we must forget all this as soon as possible and tune in to rest. After getting her suitcase, mother and son left the airport and took a cab to the hotel. Mary liked the room. It had a wonderful view of the sea. She went out onto the balcony. She took a deep breath and mentally let the present situation go. The new life continued. There were many days ahead. Rest, sun, and sea. And no more chance encounters would be able to stop me. Mary thought and went into her room and lay down on the spacious bed. The first 3 days of vacation for Mary and her son were wonderful. The weather was pleasant, and the beaches were always free with sunbeds. The only thing was that sometimes at night you could hear some of the neighbors arguing, but that didn't prevent Mary or her son from getting a good night's sleep. In the evenings, Mary liked to stand on the balcony and look out at the sea. It was a kind of daily meditation for her. She would calm down and watch the setting sun somewhere in the distance of the water surface. On the evening of the 4th day, Mary went out on the balcony as usual. It had been cloudy that day, and the sunset would not have been much to enjoy. Mary was about to leave when suddenly she heard the occupants of the room on the floor below come out onto the balcony and talk in a high-pitched tone. And Mary guessed it was the same couple who had been arguing at night. "Lizzie, are you interested in anything in this life other than money?" the man asked loudly. "Of course I do. But for me to be interested, I have to be provided for first," shouted back the girl. Mary decided to stay. Not that she liked eavesdropping, but this time she wondered to what extent a young girl's impudence could reach. Besides, the man's voice sounded familiar. "Don't I provide for you?" the man continued to ask. "Are you kidding me? He took me to this fleabag hotel, some forgotten Los Angeles, and I want Cyprus, Maldives, Bali, you know? But, Lisi, it's not a fleabag. It's a 4-star hotel. The fact that you were entertained by past attempts at the Maldives is because they only wanted your body. What else do you need? Of course, I'm trying to teach you something, to make you just a little bit smarter. You're such a pain in the ass, aren't you? You look like a young man, but you act like a stuffy old man. I'm an old man, but okay. The man's voice got a little quieter. But I'll tell you a secret. You're not getting any younger either. And as you get older, the things that rich men chase you for will disappear. And what will remain? You'll be a 40-year-old lady with the brains of a 12-year-old girl. Mary froze as the man spoke more softly. She realized it was her husband George's voice. No, he was not to be confused with anyone else. The only reason she didn't immediately recognize him was because she hardly ever saw her husband yelling. All their quarrels and misunderstandings were either silent or silent. It's just that sometimes silence has a much stronger effect on a person than yelling. And in Mary and George's marriage, too, and both partners understood that. But when the man on the floor below said, "What's left, Mary," had no doubts whatsoever. It was George's favorite phrase. He used it in every argument and every difficult conversation, as if to ask his interlocutor, "Now you're going to disagree with me, and what's going to happen? What will be left?" But this didn't seem to have any effect on George's interlocutor today. She laughed out loud. "What are you talking about? Do you hear what you're saying? Yeah, I'm going to look better at 40 than all the ex-girlfriends and soon-to-be girlfriends put together." Through laughter, she said, and walked off the balcony, slamming the door loudly. Alleged George stood for a while longer, opened the door, began to say something, and entered the room. Mary was in shock. She wanted to hear more of the voice to be sure of her guess. "Bruno, I'll be right back," Mary told her son. She left the balcony, went to the front door, ran out into the corridor, called the elevator, which treacherously long did not come. Then Mary ran to the stairs, went down one floor, and found the very room that was exactly below her and Bruno's room, forgetting all the rules of decorum. Mary leaned her ear against the door, what female curiosity can only lead to. The couple continued to quarrel. "Aren't you afraid I'll just walk out on you now?" "Where would you go?" "Anywhere." "Aren't there rich men in L.A.? I'm sure there's plenty richer than you. You'll be sorry you ever said that." "Anyway, I don't care. Go wherever and to whomever you want. I don't care about you and your men." "What a miserable old pauper you are. You're the first one to come crawling back to me, going to apologize on your knees, begging me to come back. You can think whatever you want. No one will crawl after you. What a princess you are." "Oh, she won't." "Then goodbye," said the girl, and walked loudly to the door. Mary barely had time to press against the wall. The girl jumped out of the room and ran to the elevator without Mary noticing. How awful. What am I even doing? Standing up against the wall, hiding from the couple I'd been eavesdropping on for minutes. Embarrassment. How to shame Mary her mind. But with her senses, she knew that all this eavesdropping was justified. There are no such coincidences. First the plane, then the mole, and now the voice. Either Mary was crazy, or there really was her dead husband behind the wall. But if she'd only noticed George and the man, she might have blamed it on her own sanity. George was also recognized by Bruno. You can't fool kids. Of course, some children are prone to invent non-existent images of imaginary friends. But Bruno wasn't like that. If he said he saw something, he must have seen something. Mary decided to go to the window at the end of the hall. She needed to catch her breath after such an experience, but she didn't get much rest. The door of the room opened and a man stepped out. Mary barely had time to turn away from the window so as not to give herself away prematurely. She saw in the window reflection that the man had closed the room with his card and went to the elevator. When he waited until the stall, Mary decided to follow him. She ran up the stairs and quickly descended, wanting to catch up with the elevator. She succeeded. She and the man got to the floor about the same way. Mary looked after him. If you take away a few extra pounds and a few gray hairs on his head, he looked just like George. The man was in a t-shirt and shorts, so it was not difficult for Marina to identify that man from her dead husband's appearance, and she followed him from 10 to 15 meters away. She did not understand the purpose of this surveillance, but something compelled her to keep walking. The man reached the bar and took a cocktail and sat down at the bar counter. The game of detective fascinated Mary more and more. She lifted the pattern of her blouse, mussed her hair, and put on the sunglasses hanging on her chest. Mary also walked over to the bar and, making her voice lower than usual, ordered a mojito. She drank it for about 5 minutes, while a man who looked like George drank several shots of tequila with some kind of cocktail. After another 10 minutes, the booze apparently began to take effect. "Girl, you tell me." Mary shuddered. She realized George was talking to her. There was no one else at the bar. "Why are you like this?" The man was silent, trying to find the words. "Like what?" Mary asked in a low voice. "Complicated." George chose the least offensive words. "I suppose that's what you think, isn't it? It's simpler than that? That's a woman's solidarity. Because you have absolutely no knowledge of my situation, and you tell me that I think something." "Well, I might have guessed," Mary answered intently, examining her empty glass. She was afraid to turn to face the man. "And what did you guess? Apparently, you had a fight with your girlfriend. Maybe she even ran away from you. She was abusive. She insulted you. And now you're looking for support, and for someone to tell you that you're right, that she's a child and a fool and doesn't know anything about life." Mary didn't hesitate to use the results of her eavesdropping. "Yes, you very much guessed it. I'm even a little surprised. Women's intuition does exist, but I have to disappoint you." "Why is that?" "I'm not the one who will tell you how good you are and how bad girls are. Maybe in your case the girl is really stupid, but you are not much smarter. However, you are impertinent." "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you." Mary didn't realize she was being rude herself. No, please. Tell me what you mean." Mary sighed and realized she would have to say what she really thought of men like George. "Well, no one makes you men choose young and stupid. You walk away from the smart and mature and cheat on them. And then you complain that all they want from you is money. You read me like an open book. But you know, there are also hormones that make us choose the young." "That sounds like a ridiculous excuse. The ability to fight and hold on. Your animal instincts made an ape a human being. You're supposed to be human." "I guess I am." "Well, there you go. Why the hormone story? Anyway, maybe I'm overreacting." "No, I asked you." George ordered another drink and emptied it in one gulp. "Oh, I've been drinking too much." "Excuse me, can I ask you another question?" "Go ahead. If you're so smart and you know everything about everything, tell me, what do I do next?" "I have no idea. Learn to keep my hormones in check. However, I think that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, your young companion will come back to you. What do you do with her next? Your choice. I'm not a psychologist. Should I send her away?" "Maybe," Mary answered without understanding. In fact, the purpose of this conversation, some force of attraction to George, kept her from just turning around and leaving. It demanded that she continue the conversation, even though it threatened to expose her. "Look, haven't we met somewhere before?" the man asked, just at the moment Mary thought of exposing herself. "I don't think so. This is the first time I've been here. I'm very familiar with the timbre of your voice. Could you be mistaken for someone else?" Mary came to her senses and decided to leave quickly. "Well, good luck on the personal front. I have to go. I'll see you later." Maybe Mary left the bar and called for the elevator. She knew the only thing that saved her from being found out was that George had had too much to drink. She no longer allowed the thought of this one. Man wasn't George. If before this conversation there had been a possibility that her dead husband had, for example, a brother with a similar appearance and birthmark, she now knew for certain that it was no brother. The intonation, the look, the voice, the mannerisms. Especially she remembered what George looked like when he got drunk. He never debauched. He just got a little talkative, and his behavior with girls hadn't changed in 3 years. One thing led to another. Today he quarreled with his companion and immediately had a nice conversation with Mary. Same nature now. Mary had to decide what to do next. To reveal herself, and why. What would be left, as George would ask? What would be left just for the sake of looking into his eyes? What she hadn't seen in them over the years of their relationship. But on the other hand, just for the sake of interest, why would he do that to her? Was it really because he wanted to leave this way for another family? But then he could have just left, instead of making her suffer for 3 years, miss her, and crying endlessly about what a bastard he was. Mary thought to herself as she walked into the room, not realizing how her reaction had changed. At the thought of George, if then on the plane, she'd been shaking, could barely contain her hysterics, wanted to run away, but now she was calm and sure. She didn't want to make herself known to George at any cost. The only thing that tormented her was curiosity. Did anyone else from George's past life know that he was alive? What was his name now, if the employee at the airport couldn't find him on the passenger list? After these reflections, Mary had 2 options. The first was simply to be glad that the man was alive and not dead. Go on living a quiet life, rejoicing. Rest more often, pamper herself. After a couple of years, to tell her son that, yes, Dad had just left the family. And no one knows where he is. There is no telling what is worse for the child's psyche. The sadness of knowing that Daddy died, or the resentment of knowing that Daddy betrayed Mary. It seemed the second option is more preferable. Eventually she will find another man to replace her own daddy. The second option is to meet George, no longer hiding her identity. That would be a tough conversation. Explanations, excuses. Maybe you'll have to confront some other womanizer. But the main danger with this version of Marina's feelings, they can play a cruel joke on her, making her feel love for George again. But Mary rejected that option. It was one thing to grieve for her tragically deceased husband, remembering the happy moments of their life together. It's another to see a liar, a cheat, and a scoundrel in front of you. What kind of love could there be for such a man? Mary still hadn't decided which way to go. She looked at Bruno, who was asleep, covered him up, and sighed deeply. The next day, Mary and her son, as usual, they were going to the beach. The weather had improved, and they had to hurry to get the beds. On this piece of the Black Sea beach, there were only hotel guests. Therefore, the special crowd, as is usually the case in the resorts of the Krasnodar territory, was not. But in good weather, sunbeds could be occupied. Mary stood in front of the mirror and decided what she should wear. She decided to reinsure herself and take other sunglasses, much wider, covering almost half of her face. In addition to the sunglasses, Mary wore a huge hat. She wasn't just protecting herself from the sun. If George lived directly below her, the chance of a chance encounter was too great. Mary still hadn't decided whether or not to approach her ex-husband. So for the time being, she maintained her conspiracy just in case. As she pulled herself together, she took Bruno by the hand and walked to the stall, arriving only a couple of minutes later. Apparently, all the guests had decided to go to the beach that morning. Mary and her son entered the elevator. The stall stopped on the floor below. The doors opened and a girl with dyed hair stepped into the elevator. That was George's companion. This time she was standing there without her phone and with a very unhappy face. "I had to wait a long time. They breed and then the elevators are occupied," in a nasty voice, she said. "Young lady, what do you allow yourself? There's only one elevator for every floor, and there are lots of guests." "I waited for it just as you did," Mary answered calmly. "I don't care how long you waited." The girl looked at Mary with a military look. She put on her old clothes, and she told me something else. Mary was somehow not at all annoyed by what George's companion was saying. She was above answering. Insults to insults, Mary only covered Bruno's ears, and they reached the first floor in silence. There was a commotion in the hotel lobby. The bitch of a girl immediately got lost in the crowd, which made Mary glad. After all, George's date was probably on her way to see her ex-husband. When she reached the beach, Mary realized she'd been right twice. Even last night she had told George that the girl would return to him. Things had turned out to be faster than Mary had anticipated, but the companion was indeed on her way to George's beach, whose duty it must have been to find free sun lounges. As luck would have it, 2 other vacant beds were in close proximity to the ones George had found. They were a couple of rows across. If you wanted to, you could see them lying there. You could even hear them talking. There was nothing to do. Mary didn't want to spoil her and her son's rest. She made her way to the free benches. Especially with her conspiracy, there was nothing to fear. She was in no hurry, unfolded in the sun with a protective cream, and lay down on the sunbed. She did not have to wait long for something interesting. The girl started scolding George almost immediately. "Could not you find a place closer to the sea?" She was indignant. "These were the nearest ones. To be closer to the sea, you have to get up early. They're up until 11. "Oh, who's telling me that? Who drank until 2? 0 last night. Wasn't it you? I didn't sleep. I was waiting for you. That's why I couldn't get up early. I'll remind you, my dear, that you left me yesterday. How did I know you were back in your room before 2:0? This will all be a lesson to you, so that you, afraid of losing me." George didn't say anything back, but the girl didn't stop. "I'm doing him a favor, forgetting all the insults, forgetting your lies, your insults, when I insulted you. And this vacation is not an insult, this lousy hotel. Do you know how long I waited? And today it's the damn elevator." Riding with some abandoned mom, after saying that, Mary decided to stop listening to the couple fight. She took off her hat and put her head down. But the voices still reached her. "When will you stop being so mean?" Quietly, George answered. "When will you stop being so? Oh, what do you even look like?" "Look at you." Mary carefully lifted her head and looked at George. She wondered what he looked like. As she looked at her ex-husband's face, she was a little startled. George was closer. His eyes were running and his hands felt as if they were not obeying him. Apparently, he had sat at the bar last night for a really long time. "Lizzie, I need to lie down," said George, and unconsciously collapsed on the recliner. George yelled out, "A girl! What's the matter with you? Somebody help him!" Instantly, George's girl, Lisa's irritation turned into fear. It was obvious from her face that she was genuinely afraid for her man. The source of this fear was unclear. Was the girl afraid of losing the man she loved? Or was she afraid of losing the purse that provided her? But to George, her fear was meaningless. Lizzie was only frightened, screaming and taking no real action to help. Then Mary jumped up from the recliner and ran over to George. She checked his breathing and pulse. George was breathing, but his pulse was weak. "Get an umbrella to cover him from the sun," Mary commanded Lizzie. "What? What umbrella?" Why did you show wonders of intelligence in an emergency situation? Girlfriend. Okay, just go to the hotel for a doctor. Quickly, the girl ran to the hotel, and Mary realized that the first aid she would have to give herself. The rest of the people on the beach only watched curiously. Mary jumped George's leg into her lap, turned him on his side, and tipped his head back to clear his airway. Then she ran to the sun lounger by the sea, picked up a sun umbrella, and set it down beside George. After about 30 seconds, the man began to regain consciousness. He slowly opened his eyes, and he saw Mary. She was looking at him without her glasses or hat. Mary, it's you. Not articulate, George asked. I am, Mary answered, realizing that she had completely forgotten about the conspiracy. At the same time, Lizzie returned from the hotel with the doctor. The doctor came over to George, and Mary moved over. Back on her recliner, she saw the doctor inject her ex-husband with something. He checked his pulse and turned to Lizzie. It's all right. A simple fainting spell. Probably from overheating. Now we need to get him to a cool room and let him rest. How am I going to take him? The girl was surprised. Yes, I'll drive myself. George whispered. He got up from the sun lounger and looked around. But she, just in time, put her hat and glasses back on and was out of George's sight. Then he and his girlfriend went back to the hotel. Mary was left lying on the beach. The situation became even more complicated. George knows she saw him, but they never got to talk. Either he rushes this into a dystopian rave, or he will be looking for her. Mary's desire to see George again was finally gone. She looked at Bruno sitting on the phone and thought about his reaction. At Daddy, George would almost certainly want to see his son, and maybe even get involved in his upbringing. What happened today showed him who he's better off with. The world, savvy women, or the silly, mercurial girls. Mary didn't want George back in her life. Or rather, she was very much afraid of it, especially if George began to repent and apologize to her. Mary was a wise enough girl to forgive a lot. But to forgive betrayal, even for her, was too much. Mary packed her bags and went with her son to lunch at the hotel cafe. She saw George and every man sitting there. Anxiety made it impossible for her to eat normally. She took Bruno by the hand and led him back to his room. No sooner had she laid down on the bed than the telephone rang. The phone was somewhere in her beach bag, and Mary couldn't find it. At the same moment, there was a knock at the door. Mary shouted, "Wait a second," and continued looking for the phone. After a couple of seconds, it stopped ringing, and the knock on the door rang again. "What's the matter?" "I told you to wait a while." Irritated, I went to Mary's exit and opened the door. There was George standing in the hallway. Mary immediately closed the door. "Mary, wait," heard George's voice from the hallway. Mary stood there for a few seconds. Thinking, she opened the door. "How did you find me?" "At the front desk, and asked what room my wife was in and called your name." "I'm not your wife," Mary replied sternly to her ex-husband's resourcefulness. "I understand how you feel right now, but let's talk. I'm asking you. You don't understand anything. Give me a chance to explain something." "Not right now. The baby will hear. Let's do it tonight at the hotel bar at 10. 0. Okay." Mary's curiosity got the better of her. "Please come." Mary closed the door. Now she had to prepare herself mentally to talk to her ex-husband. But she didn't know how. For the rest of the time before the talk, she couldn't find herself. What would George tell her? What would George tell her? What story would he invent? Would she believe a word he said? These were questions to which Mary had no answers. The only thing she said herself was to be tough, unsentimental, and critical of everything she heard. With these thoughts in mind, after putting Bruno to bed, she went to a bar. She chose a table at the back of the bar where the music was least audible. Mary waited. 10 minutes later, George showed up at the entrance. Mary made no sign to let him find her quickly. The man walked carefully around the bar and reached the farthest table. "Well, hello, Mary," George said in a guilty voice. "Have we seen each other before?" Mary cut off. "Did you order anything?" "No." "Did you come here for a drink? It'll make it easier to talk. I'll be right back." George went to the bar, ordered 2 cocktails, and brought them to the table. "The doctors have cleared you for drinking. I don't think it's a good idea to drink after a fainting spell. I got a non-alcoholic. Oh, by the way, thank you for helping me at the beach today. If it wasn't for you, I don't know if she'd have thought to call a doctor at least." "You're welcome. Why don't you take care of your health with a hangover in the heat? You know, I've stopped paying attention to how I'm feeling lately. Maybe I should be more attentive. I mean, it's not like I'm 18 anymore." No, why? You've been dead a long time. A dead man doesn't need to be healthy." "Mary," George sighed heavily. "I'm going to start talking now. Please don't interrupt me. Listen to me, please." "I'll try. Anyway, 3 years ago I started receiving threats. Our firm had crossed the path of a very serious organization. It all started when I took out a loan for our new project. Not the bank, of course. The bank would not give anything under such conditions. That is why I turned to this shady organization. We signed a contract. A very large sum of money was transferred to our account, but the contractor we selected did not fulfill his obligations and disappeared. Then, as their representative said, they were seen in Cyprus. But not the point. I applied to the credit organization, explained the situation. But of course, no one would listen to me. I was given a month to pay back the debt. We went to the police, but they said that they couldn't help me, because both the organization and the contractor were working unofficially. Since then, they started calling me, sending me mails. I was afraid that they would start coming to our house. They demanded a refund. And how would I find that amount of money in a month? Every day, the threats came more and more often. So I decided to go far away, to the Arctic. After being there for a couple of weeks, I was about to go back as the security guard at the holiday home where I was staying informed me that a group of young, athletic-looking men were interested in me. I realized they had found me. There was nowhere to run. They would have caught up with me at the airport or the train station. Yes, living in a vacation home. I was confused. It seemed like my life was over. I remember I ran out into the woods. Miraculously, I found a connection and got through to our CEO, Michael. I remember the conversation very well. At first, he interrupted me and told me that you called and asked where I was. I'm sorry, but I couldn't tell you. Anyway, I told him everything. That's when we came up with a plan to fake my death. We used to go snowmobiling there in Baikal. That's what we decided to get hooked on. I told the company employees with whom I was there that we needed to give the news of my death and to sort things out with the rescuers. Michael was supposed to spread the word around the firm and then come to you. How could you? Mary whispered. I was saving a life, and not just my own. They could have pressured me through you. George took a sip of his cocktail and continued. Michael promised he would help you. He did. Well, at least that's the way it is. You think some money, some inheritance, could have made me feel any better? I haven't lived in 3 years, you know. This is the first vacation I've been on in a long time. I'm sorry, but I have no choice left. Understand, you could have gone with us abroad to hide there. Why did you choose the cruelest way? These people would have gotten to you from abroad as well. Moreover, I was in such a situation that I wouldn't have had time to go anywhere. I was practically pinned against the wall. You could have talked about your problems right away. I didn't have to wait for the tipping point. I didn't want to burden you. We had a little baby, so you didn't need to be afraid. You remembered about the baby. How many times have you seen him in the last year of your life? I'm in a lot of pain. In those 3 years, I realized how much I missed my son. How do you do it? Mary exclaimed, coming out of everything dry, out of water, hurt, weak. I realized I meant well. Didn't mean to be a burden. But if you missed your son so much, why didn't you let him know you were alive? I couldn't do that. The danger persisted. I wasn't supposed to be in town at all. And the phone calls? Phone could have been tapped. I couldn't imagine. How would you have reacted to a call from beyond the grave? It's very noble to leave your wife in mourning for 3 years with a young child. I'd hoped that you would quickly forget me. Our relationship was far from perfect by then. I wonder whose fault that was. I admit that it was my fault, among other things, and for what was going on with our relationship. And what am I to do about it? Throw myself for joy on your neck? Don't be ironic. I feel really bad. Okay, next is what you had. And the next thing was 2 years of nonstop running. I changed my last name. I lived in different cities, but I never found a place anywhere. With great relief, I received the news that the same financial institution, which I owed, was liquidated, and its management employees. And the bouncer was arrested. I came straight away, back to our town, and with the help of old connections organized a new business. It's not much profit, but it's livable. Did you ever think about Bruno and me when you got back? I remembered more than once. But the truth is, I was pretty sure you'd forgotten me by then. So I didn't report myself. I decided that there was no past George. Now there is a new George with a new business and a new personal life. You changed your last name? Yeah, I thought it was symbolic. Original, Mary laughed. I remembered your laugh sometimes. Stop it. I can't hear it. You don't have to play the suffering husband and father here. He remembered. And when he started going away on his endless vacations, leaving me and Bruno alone, he remembered my laughter too. I told you I was guilty before you. I was a complete idiot. It's good that you admit it, but your remorse does nothing to undo my years of worry. I don't know why you wanted to talk to me in the first place. First of all, I just wanted to explain myself, and second, to hear your forgiveness. So you thought you were going to tell your hard story about how you were threatened, that you had no choice, and I would get upset and forgive your cheating and betrayal? George didn't know what to answer. He looked into his empty glass and was about to go for the next one. George stood up and immediately sat back down. What's the matter with you? Mary thought George was getting sick again. It's about to get loud. Please don't pay attention to anything or listen to anything. Mary at first did not understand what set of words her ex-husband had uttered. But after a moment, George's current girlfriend, Lizzie, came to the table. Oh, where are you, you bastard? I knew you'd run to the pussy bar, she said loudly and slapped George in the face. Lizzie, you've got it all wrong. I got it all wrong about you a long time ago. You're not a man. You can't provide for me. You're running around with other women, too. Lizzie looked at Mary. You know she's with a trailer. I saw them in the elevator. She wants to use you. Idiot. Lizzie, stop it right now. No. Let her go on. Mary joined the conversation. You're such a bitch. And you're going to sass me. Lizzie turned to Mary and tried to grab her by the hair. But George got up in time. He yanked his girl back and sat her down next to him. Let me go. Let me go now. Let me go now, George said loudly. It wasn't her fault. And it was her fault for stealing other people's men. Lizzie wasn't going to calm down. You're absolutely right, Mary continued to provoke the girl. That is why I came to this bar to steal your dear man. Such a faithful, loyal and honest man is no longer to be found. So you've lost your happiness in an unequal struggle with me. Mary, but where are you going? George tried. To appease his ex-wife, too. Let go of me. I'll tear her curls off, Lizzie screamed. All right, that's enough. Lizzie, that's my ex-wife. The girl instantly calmed down like a wife. The same one you left years ago. Yes, she is. With a slight and awkwardness, George replied, trying to hide his eyes. Gone years ago. Mary, the wording was interesting. I'd even say failed. No, better yet, drowned. George didn't react to this in any way. Of course, he didn't tell his new girlfriend about all his adventures. Wait, Lizzie wondered. But that kid I saw her with is yours. It's mine. I thought you said you didn't have kids. I lied. Lizzie was silent for a while. She needed to process what she'd heard. Don't worry about it. Mary turned to her in a calm tone. It has nothing to do with this. It's got nothing to do with the baby. Only biologically. The boy has almost forgotten his father. So you can consider that he wasn't lying. Marry me, George tried to justify himself. I can't believe I didn't realize how ugly you are, Lizzie interrupted George. You left your wife and child, and you're gonna leave me just the same. I can't see you anymore. Goodbye. Lisa jumped up and ran out of the bar. George ran after her. Mary was left alone with her unbeaten cocktail. Could she have thought a week ago, how would this first vacation in years turn out? After such a vacation, as they say, one would need another vacation. So many events would take a long time to comprehend. But inwardly, she was glad. First, that George was alive. Yes, he was a scoundrel, a traitor, and a liar. But he was alive. In the second place, Mary knew that the former mourning period of her life was over. Now there would be new complications. Stories about his father. But it's all just that. Ongoing domestic problems, not tragedies. At the very least, and life will become much more interesting than before. So she didn't even pay attention to the yelling, insults, and attempts to grab her by the hair on the part of this heated girl, because she understood that a new phase of life had begun, and the past would never come back, not even in her memories. Mary got up and leisurely walked out of the bar. She felt like taking a little walk in the fresh air. There was no one in the hotel courtyard anymore. Everyone was either in their rooms or in bars and restaurants. I breathed in the warm Krasnodar air. Mary felt free. The morning shackles were broken. She stepped out into a small square and saw George sitting on a bench. Judging by your expression, you couldn't catch up with her, Mary said, and sat down next to her ex-husband. It worked, but I think she left me for good this time. Now they're taking things out of the room. Why did you even need this kindergarten thing? You didn't have 1 minute where you weren't fighting. I heard details of your relationship every night, and I don't know what was holding her back. She's young, didn't really want young energy, had fun. Tell me about it, George said with a wave of his hand. Look, I don't want to scold you anymore, especially since you know all about yourself. But don't you feel sorry for yourself? What do you mean? Well, look, all your life you've been running somewhere, trying to chase the money. Got a threat to your life that forced you to fake your own demise. Tried to chase happiness in your personal life. Got this naive young girl. You're not even old yet, and you're already fainting in a hangover. Why did you have to go through all this? Where did you come from? You know, over the last few years, I've come close to asking myself that question directly. But every time I've run away from it with trivial excuses. Money, you can never have too much of it. It gives freedom, security. Truth is, for me, it was the opposite. Relationships are like that. This new energy, young blood. There's more vitality, more joy. And here it's gone. I don't know, I'm completely lost. But you are. You drove yourself into this state. Lost, yourself lost. But you're not feeling sorry for yourself right now. Is it possible to feel sorry for yourself in different ways? Of course you have destructive self-pity. It doesn't do any good. It's more the opposite. It will bury you even more. You're not feeling sorry for yourself. You're seeking productive pity. Yes, my mistakes got me into a tough situation, but I'm strong enough to rethink my principles and try to rebuild things. Well, sort of. Before she knew it, Mary's anger toward George had disappeared. She saw a weak, insecure man, and a completely harmless one at that. She wanted to help him somehow. For a second, Mary was even frightened that this was how her awakened feelings were manifesting themselves. After all, this was what she had feared the first time she had seen her ex-husband. Pity and love are absolutely different things, though sometimes it can be difficult to tell them apart. And it was pity that Mary had. Mary, thank you. For what? At one point in our conversation in the bar, I thought you were just going to slap me in the face. You come back and run away. Thank you for not doing that. I did have that thought, Mary grinned, but curiosity overcame me. Say, how come you weren't afraid to go back to town at all? You knew so many friends there, didn't you? Bruna and I might have spotted you after all. I didn't live in the city. I lived in a cottage community. I never went downtown. I worked mostly remotely. I only went into town by car. And then I dramatically changed my name and surname. That seemed to be enough. And indeed, the conspiracy had been successful before I met you. It was quite successful the first time I met you. Mary remembered the first time seeing George at the airport, but the wide hat prevented her from recognizing him as her ex-husband. And if it hadn't been for Bruno, maybe you and I wouldn't even be sitting here. He recognized me? Yeah, I didn't expect him to. I hoped he'd forgotten all about me. George sighed heavily. Mary, I want to see him. Why would you want to meet him? I understand that I will never be a full-fledged father to him again. But I really want to see him. You said yourself that I could rebuild everything. Give me that opportunity, please. Mary didn't know what to say to George. Perhaps right now, when Bruno is still young enough and not going through puberty. It was about time to bring his father's presence back into the family. But Mary was afraid to take such drastic steps. She was used to raising Bruno alone. I don't know. This meeting might be very difficult for him. I understand. I'll try to be as discreet as possible. Okay, but let's do this. I'll get him ready in the morning and warn him about you. Then we'll meet. We'll talk a little bit. After the meeting, I'll talk to him alone again. And only if he wants to see you again. We'll see what to do next. Sure, tomorrow at 11:00. At the hotel cafe. Just remember, for Bruno, you're a traveler, exploring new land. That's an interesting idea. I got it. Mary said goodbye and went to her room. She struggled and so could not sleep until morning. It was hard for her to imagine how tomorrow's meeting would go. The meeting, how Bruno would react, how George would hold up. There were too many factors to foresee. Or maybe the son just wouldn't want to see his father again. In these reflections, Mary lay awake until the alarm clock rang. She set it for 10:00 so she could get ready and explain everything to Bruno. Mom, are we going out tonight? He asked as he watched his mother do his makeup. Yes. Mary turned to Bruno. Remember the passenger on the plane you called Daddy? I do. Anyway, you were right. It really did turn out to be your daddy. Can you believe it? Back from his trip straight to L.A. I told you. The boy cheered. And we're going to see him today. Yeah, he'll be very happy to see you. And I'll see him. Mary was delighted at her son's reaction. His father was interesting to him, which meant that psychologically this meeting was not going to be as difficult for Bruno as it might have been. Where had he been for so long? The boy wondered. He will tell you everything himself. As the time approached the cherished 11 o'clock, Marion left the room. She was more worried. Shouldn't it be too late to cancel the meeting? Let it stay the way it was. No, there was no turning back. Mary had already told Bruno all about the sudden cancellation, would cause the boy just the kind of psychological trauma that his mother was so worried about. Mary and her son made their way to the cafe, which was on the first floor of the hotel. George was already seated inside. When he saw his ex-wife and son, he stood up and walked toward them. Daddy said loudly to Bruno, and he walked toward George too. "Hello, hello, my boy," said George, hugging his son. Mary said hello to her ex-husband, and they all sat down at the table together. "Well, tell us how you live," George turned to his son. "We're having fun. It's so cool here. This is the first time my mom and I have been on such a great trip. You guys are great, and I remembered you all the time." The boy continued to share his impressions. Mary looked at him with surprise. "You did. I remembered you." Really, really. Only I could see that Mother wasn't very happy. When I started asking about you, I think it was because she was very worried about you. So I tried not to talk about you in front of her anymore, just thinking, where have you been all this time? Well, Mom must have been telling you something. George was doing his best to hold back tears. I was away, and there was no way I could come to you. It's my job, you know, to travel to different towns, villages, forests, lakes, exploring dangerous areas. This work requires a constant presence, and we travelers see our families very rarely. Why don't you quit your job so your mother and I can see you more often? Well, somebody has to do it, so let those who don't have anybody to come, who no one is waiting for. George realized. He could no longer contain his emotions. He faked an emergency phone call and ran to the bathroom. Yes, sometimes men need to cry in these situations too. "See how busy Daddy's job is," said Mary, left alone with her son. Even on vacation, they keep calling and distracting. "And why does he need such a job?" The boy was indignant. Everyone has their own vocation. After a couple of minutes, George returned. "I'm sorry. Please, I had to interrupt. And we were just talking about your hard work and the long hours that keep you from seeing your son." Mary, it was getting to the point. George's continued involvement in Bruno's upbringing. "Yeah, about George's job, it's a little confusing. You know, Bruno, I quit that job, right off the phone." "You did?" "Yay." "Are we going to see each other more often now?" joyfully asked the boy. "Yes. We'll definitely see each other more often." George looked at Mary. "Well, if Mother doesn't mind, of course." "Mother, can you mind?" Bruno was surprised. "Not at all. Of course, I wouldn't mind it. But how often you see each other will depend a great deal on Daddy. I promise we'll see each other as often as possible," George told his son firmly. "Why can't you just start living with us like you used to?" George didn't know what to answer Bruno. He looked at his ex-wife confusedly. Mary tried to get out of a difficult situation. And because Daddy would gradually have to start a new life, find a new job, and he won't have enough time to be with us all the time. And then, when he does, he can. Right? Bruno put Mary and George in an even more awkward position. There's no telling what will happen then, and we'll see. Mary walked away from the answer. George, Mary, and Bruno sat at the table and chatted for a long time. They talked about vacations, the sea, and travel. They talked about their lives and made plans for the future. The day did not end with breakfast in the cafe. They all went to the beach together. George even started to teach his son to swim. It was as if they understood each other at a glance. Even with his mother, there was no learning process of any kind with his mother. Mary watched all this and remembered the time when she and George had just begun their relationship and when Bruno had just come into the world. It was a pleasant nostalgia, but very quickly, Mary pulled herself together again. You couldn't just pick up and forget George's actions, his cheating and betrayal. The fact that he and his son had worked out a relationship, that was fine. But he had to keep his distance, not to step on the same rake. Even though George had changed a lot in the meantime. Toward evening, the three of them went for a walk around town. From the outside, Mary and George looked like a real happy family. It got dark and they walked back to the hotel. After saying goodbye at the elevator, Mary and Bruno went into their room. "Did you have a nice time with your father?" Mary asked. "I want to spend every day like that together. Every day." "Will it work? We have to leave tomorrow." "Like tomorrow?" "Yes." Mary, with all the adventures with George, it's as if she'd forgotten that the vacation was coming to an end. "Oh, that's too bad. We're going back with Daddy. No, he's flying back later. We'll meet him in our own town next time." "Wait again? Don't worry, you will have a much shorter wait this time," Mary answered hopefully. "But Mom, why can't you live together like before?" "I told you, this is life. Sometimes we have to choose something we don't really like. That's the way Dad had to choose. But we're going to change anyway. We will go on trips like this more often and see Daddy more often, and you will like it." But after a few minutes, the phone rang. Mary quietly went out on the balcony and closed the door tightly so as not to wake up her son. "Hello, Mary. It's you." George's voice came through the receiver. "Yes. Do you still have my number? You see, well, how's Bruno? You talk to him. He's happy, and that's great. Shall we walk again tomorrow then?" "No, we're leaving tomorrow." I almost forgot myself. Good thing the reminder on my phone worked. Oh, that was fast. I'm only 3 days away. And there's no chance to meet tomorrow at all. Just for a little while in the morning, just the two of us. I told Bruno that the next time you'd meet would be after we arrived. Why are you in such a hurry? He's already had too many impressions from today. I think it's better to build up contact gradually. You're probably right. Where should we meet? Let's meet in the square in the hotel courtyard. All right then. Good night and see you tomorrow. This time Mary fell asleep quickly, in spite of her impending encounter with her ex-husband. It was the effect of a sleepless night and a busy day. "Mom, where are you going?" asked sleepily, seeing that my mother was going somewhere again. "I'm going to run some errands. Go to sleep quickly." Mary quickly left the room, took the elevator down to the first floor, and went out into the hotel courtyard. George wasn't there yet. Why was I out so early? Mary thought. I should have been late. I'd made an even more exciting morning for myself, but I didn't have to wait long. It wasn't long before George, in his light-colored suit and his big hat, came into the square. "You've been waiting a long time." "No, just a few minutes." "Listen, since we're going to be taking a break again, not a big one, of course, just a couple of days, but a break, I'd like to ask you something. Were you able to forgive me after all?" "Yes, I did," Mary answered calmly. "I rarely hold a grudge for long. And what is there to be offended about? Your weakness. Weakness is not a crime. So you can live your life in peace. I don't hold a grudge against you. You're a very wise woman." I couldn't sleep for a long time. I kept thinking about Bruno and about you. Remember when he asked me why we couldn't start living together again? I remember. Last night he asked me that question again. So maybe he's right after all. If you forgave me, if we got along well with Bruno, why don't we start over? How does that sound? Do you agree? "No," Mary answered after a short silence. How difficult it was to get that word out of her. The possibility of repeating past marital bliss beckoned. Marina's feelings for George had flared up again, but she restrained herself. Mary remembered the warning she had given herself, then on the beach, not to step on the same rake. Hasty, yes, might have turned out to be that rake. It all came too quickly and too suddenly. In fact, she had only known the new George for a few days. For the beginning of a serious relationship and life together, that wasn't enough, and the forgiveness she had given George. Not at all to allow this relationship to begin to grow is one thing, and to prevent a new grudge is quite another. George did not argue with Marina's rejection. He shook his head and said, "I understand your answer. If I were you, I wouldn't forgive myself at all. But thank you already for that. The main thing is that mine. The rejection had no effect on the child having a father again. You don't have to worry about that. I'll be there as soon as I get there. Please text me when you're leaving and be in touch afterwards. I will. Don't get lost either. We won't get lost this time." Mary had to get back to her room and get ready for the airport. And she and George obviously wanted to hug good. Bye, but they didn't. Perhaps by saying no, Mary had made the hardest choice of her life. She had been a hard-hearted person from an early age, and here it was a question of feelings. In doing so, Mary proved to herself that she was as strong and independent of her feeling. As she turned around, she heard George call out to her, "Wait a minute. There's something else, isn't there? Tell me, please. Is your rejection permanent, or do I still have a chance?" "We'll see," Mary answered. She walked quickly to the hotel. Already in the elevator, tears came to her eyes. No, they were not tears of sadness from saying goodbye to George. After all, in just a few days, they would see each other again. They were tears of joy. Joy at the new sensations, the new pages of life. During those days of vacation, Mary had learned a different way of thinking about life. Manage her emotions and feelings, to find a father for her child, but at the same time not to get into a mindless, naive relationship with George. It's the kind of balance only a wise woman can strike. And that's exactly what Mary became on these warm summer days.